So we are going to be looking at David and Jonathan. Study on friendship. The story of David and Jonathan provides us with an excellent example of biblical friendship, in part because there's so much detail available. And the story begins long before they actually meet. At first glance, Jonathan and David don't seem to have much in common. Jonathan was a prince in line to be king. David was a shepherd. Jonathan owned his own armor. David went into battle with a slingshot. Jonathan was trained in the art of war. David was trained to tend sheep. Jonathan was King Saul's oldest son. David was the youngest of 8 sons. Jonathan was from the tribe of Benjamin. David was from the tribe of Judah. Also, Jonathan was roughly 30 years older than David.
1 Samuel 13 verse 1 to 2 tells us, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 8,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. And Numbers 1 verse 1 to 3 states, the Lord spoke to Moses. He said, take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one. You and Aaron are to count according to their divisions all the men in Israel who are 20 years old or more and able to serve in the army.
Comparing these two passages, it's likely that Jonathan was at least 20 years old when he took command of a third of his father's army. Saul reigned for 42 years, so Jonathan was probably at least 60 when he died in battle with his father. 2 Samuel 5, verse 4 to 5, reports that David was 30 years old when he began to reign shortly thereafter, suggesting that he was around 30 when Jonathan died around ages 60 to 62. So let's read through some of their story to discover what held their friendship together. You all know the story of David and Goliath. The Israelite army led by King Saul was facing off against the Philistines, who sent out their champion Goliath to fight Israel's champion. We were told earlier that Saul was a head taller than anyone else, so he should have probably have been their champion, but he didn't step forward. While all of Israel's soldiers were immobilized in fear of Goliath, David showed up to bring grain, bread, and cheese to his 3 older brothers on the front line. Hearing how Goliath taunted the Israelites and trash-talked their God, David was furious that no one had challenged the giant. He offered to be Israel's champion against Goliath. The king offered David his armor, which he declined, and the courageous shepherd ran into battle with a sling and 5 stones. David killed the giant with his first stone, cut off his head, and took Goliath's weapons. So, why hadn't Jonathan gone out to fight Goliath when his father didn't?
One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. That's from 1 Samuel 14 verse 1. You don't need an armor-bearer unless you have armor.
According to 1 Samuel 23, the Philistines knew how to fashion iron into weapons, but the Israelites had no blacksmiths. Only King Saul and Jonathan had swords and spears. Thus, Jonathan would have been sufficiently armed. And we now know why David claimed Goliath's weapons. Was Jonathan too afraid to fight Goliath? Let's read a story about Jonathan that tells us a lot about his character.
1 Samuel 14, selected verses. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." Continuing in 1 Samuel 14. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre.
So it seems unlikely that Jonathan was afraid to fight Goliath. His actions here don't sound like cowardice. So why hadn't Jonathan gone out to fight Goliath when his father didn't? I'm guessing here, but I suspect that King Saul forbade his son to fight Goliath. Jonathan had faith in God, but his father did not. After all, Saul eventually turned to the witch of Endor for advice. By then, God had stopped answering Saul's requests.
In 1 Samuel 28, verse 4 to 6, we read, "When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets."
So looking at similarities between Jonathan and David, we now know that both men had a common belief that with faith in God, they could prevail against a seemingly unbeatable foe. Jonathan versus a Philistine garrison.
"Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few."
David versus Goliath.
"I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head."
So now grab your worksheet and let's fill in the first slide together. Start with the middle column. What character trait did we just read that both men possessed? Courage, trusting God. Okay. So in the middle column, we're going to write trusting God. So trusting God goes in the middle column of the first row, or you could write synonyms like reliance on God or faith in God. What's an antonym? The opposite for trust in God. Distrust, self-reliance. Now in the Jonathan's column, you will write the reference, which is 1 Samuel 14, verse 6. And In David's column, the reference is 1 Samuel 17, verse 45 to 46. All right, so you can see there in the top row, has everyone managed to write that down? So all the things that's in red on that worksheet should now be on your physical worksheet. Okay, we all fine? Good. So let's start reading in 1 Samuel 18, immediately after Jonathan had killed David, had watched David kill Goliath, to learn more similarities between the two men.
Verses 1 to 4. After he had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt.
So what have we learned about Jonathan? First, note that Jonathan made a covenant, a promise to David. We can't say that he was a promise keeper because we don't as yet have enough information. But tuck that one away in your mind, please.
Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. 1 Samuel 18, verse 4.
So what would you name this character trait? Would you call it generosity, giving, selfless, or altruism? Yeah, that's a very fancy word. Pick one for the middle column. So it chose generosity. And what would the antonym be? So I would call, you choose one for yourselves. Choose an antonym, whether selfishness or self-centeredness. So now the biblical reference. So use the reference above to fill in Jonathan's column in the second row, and we'll be waiting for evidence of David's generosity for the third column. So we are looking at 1 Samuel 18, verse 4 in the first column. The next passage of interest is also in 1 Samuel 18, the story of David's engagement to Jonathan's sister, Michal. The details are gory, involving the death and mutilation of 200 Philistines, but it actually also reveals a positive character trait of David.
Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah.
Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they were told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she might be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law."
Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David. But David said, Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known.
So what have we learned about David? So 1 Samuel 18 verse 18, David said to Saul, who am I and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? Yeah. Verse 23, David said, do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. What would you name this character trait? So Landi suggested humble, yeah, humility. Okay, so that's a character trait. In the middle column, and an antonym, arrogance or pride. So use the references above to fill in David's column in the third row. We'll be watching for evidence of Jonathan's humility for the first column. So in David's column, you want to write 1 Samuel 18, verse 18 and 23. Are you seeing the pattern of how to fill out your worksheet? So moving into the next chapter, 1 Samuel 19, verse 1 to 5.
Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?
Now we have evidence that Jonathan is a promise keeper. He risked his relationship with his father for the sake of his friend. So let's log in this character trait for Jonathan. Promise keeping is one name for it. See another name? Reliability. Yeah, that's what I thought. Faithfulness, loyalty, reliability, trustworthiness. So you can choose one of those, and then an antonym would be unreliable, unfaithful, untrustworthy. Disloyalty. Sorry, I'm jumping here. Lots of words beginning with un. So untrustworthiness, unfaithfulness, or unreliable. So that is in your antonym. So it's still a middle column. Did you catch the biblical reference? It is 1 Samuel 19, verse 1 to 5. And that is in the Jonathan column. 1 Samuel 19. Okay. Before we read further in the 19th chapter, I'd like to back up to an incident in chapter 18.
The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house, while David was playing the lyre as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice.
Did you catch that? Saul threw a spear at David twice in one day. So returning to chapter 19, after Jonathan had pleaded with his father, King Saul took an oath not to kill David. Consequently, wanting to believe his father, Jonathan reassured his friend. David returned to the palace, continued to lead successful campaigns against the Philistines, and to play his lyre for the king. But then
an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape.
That's 3 attempts on David's life. Did David have a death wish? Why did he keep putting his life in danger by playing for King Saul? In 1 Samuel 16 verse 23, it tells us,
whenever the spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better and the evil spirit would leave him.
David wasn't stupid. He was being compassionate at the risk of his own life. So let's log in that tray for David in the 5th row. I'm calling David's characteristic compassion. I don't like the word sympathy. That implies pity. And pity implies that the pitying person is feeling some superior in some way to the one being pitied. So we got compassion. Does anyone know how sympathy and empathy are different from each other? Sympathy is just feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is actually feeling that person's pain. So empathy is a synonym for compassion. So is kind-heartedness. So what would the antonym be? Cold-heartedness, callousness, unfeeling. Yeah, I had hard-heartedness in mind. So you can write one of those, whichever one you would want to. So I'm going to start it. And the reference, which will be in the David's column, would be 1 Samuel 16, verse 23. After King Saul's 3rd attempt on his life, David escapes to Naioth. Then
David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said to himself, 'Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved.' Yet, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you."
So Jonathan and David devised a plan by which they could determine for certain whether Saul intended to kill David. Then David exclaimed,
"As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father?" "Never," Jonathan said. "If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?"
There's a lot in this chapter to unpack that reflects the type of friendship that existed between Jonathan and David. So let's start. First, notice Jonathan's comment to David. "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you." That's more proof that Jonathan intended to be faithful to the covenant that he had made with David. So 1 Samuel 20 verse 4 is another Bible reference for Jonathan's 4th row. So you want to add that to 1 Samuel 20 verse 4. I should have written smaller. I filled the whole block, Deb. Actually, notice how David lays himself bare, asking Jonathan to judge him. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father? Not only is David being courageous, but he's also willing to face himself honestly, willing to let Jonathan be his judge and executioner if appropriate. We see the same brutal honesty reflected in one of David's psalms.
Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Psalm 139, verse 23 and 24.
We now have another character trait to add on row 6 for David, honesty. That comes in the middle. Synonyms for honesty: truthfulness, sincerity, candor, straightforwardness. And what would an antonym be? Dishonesty, lying, deceit. The Bible reference for David is 1 Samuel 20, verse 8. There's a similar statement made by Jonathan. Let's take a look. Previously, we read the story about Jonathan's daring attack on the Philistines, but there's more to that account. Remember that when Jonathan set out on his mission, he did not tell his father. No one was aware that Jonathan had left.
Then panic struck the whole Philistine army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven.
Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire enemy entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. So continuing in 1 Samuel 14.
But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Later, Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But no one of them said a word. Saul then said to the Israelites, "You stand over there. I and Jonathan my son will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied.
So King Saul cast lots to determine who had broken the oath that he had imposed on his men about not eating. And the lot identified Jonathan as the guilty party.
Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die?" Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death.
So here's the same character trait for Jonathan: honesty. So the Bible reference for Jonathan is 1 Samuel 14, verse 43. Now continuing in chapter 20. Jonathan and David go together into a field where they also agree on a way by which Jonathan can notify David of his father's intent. Once the details are hashed out, Jonathan makes another promise and a request of David, probably because he suspects that they may never see each other again.
Then Jonathan said to David, "I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself.
And now we need to fast forward a bit to find out if David also kept his promises. As mentioned earlier, Jonathan died in battle with his father, King Saul. Once David became king, he asked,
"Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." So King David had brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table."
Did you catch that? Here then, in 2 Samuel 9, verse 3 to 7, is our evidence that David too was a loyal promise keeper. Please add that Bible reference to David's column, row 4, as well as the verse where David made his covenant with Jonathan. So that is column 4, David's column, 1 Samuel 20, verse 14 to 17. How come I haven't got that other reference in? Okay, and 2 Samuel 9, verse 3 to 7. Additionally, that story reveals another of David's character traits, generosity. So use the same Bible reference in David's column, row 2. So that in row 2, you want to write 2 Samuel. Is it 1 Samuel 20? Yeah, sorry. So it's 1 Samuel 20, verse 14 to 17. Let's keep unpacking chapter 20. As Jonathan and David had agreed, David absented himself from a 2-day feast in Saul's palace, while Jonathan felt out his father's intent. The first day, King Saul assumed that David was not in attendance because something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. The second day, the king asked why David wasn't at the feast, and Jonathan made an excuse for him. Saul wasn't convinced.
Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David.
Are you following this? Jonathan was next in line to be king. It would have been so easy for Jonathan to betray David to preserve his right to Israel's throne as Saul's firstborn son, but he risks his life to defend David. So here's yet another outstanding character trait for Jonathan, choosing the morally upright thing, regardless of what is personally lost by doing so. So we now are in the third column from the bottom, the third row from the bottom. So we want to write their moral uprightness or virtue, honorableness, integrity. So have you got an antonym? Just think about King Saul. Immorality, shamefulness, evil, wickedness. I would have also gone for wickedness. That he was whacked. Wickedness. The Bible reference for Jonathan is 1 Samuel 20, verse 30 to 33. As prearranged, Jonathan signaled to David that it wasn't safe for him to come home.
Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town.
Thereafter, David went into exile on the run from King Saul for years until both Saul and Jonathan were killed battling the Philistines. But these two men met one more time.
While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh.
That brief encounter revealed a lot about Jonathan's character. Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. "Don't be afraid," he said. That's an amazingly encouraging friend. So second row from the bottom, a synonym for encouragement could be reassurance, hopefulness, optimism. And an antonym, pessimism, discouragement, negativity. The Bible reference for Jonathan is 1 Samuel 23, verse 16 to 17. But wait, there's more. Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in the Lord. Don't be afraid, he said. I'm thinking that Jonathan had also demonstrated compassion. If you agree with me, you can use that same Bible reference on row 5. 1 Samuel 23, verse 16 to 17. That's in the Jonathan column. And then Jonathan exclaims, my father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. What do you hear in that statement? Humility. Humility, right? Once again, 1 Samuel 23, verse 16 to 17. But this time on row 3. So let's do a quick check. Where do we still have empty spaces on our charts? An example of moral uprightness for David. Yep. An example of encouragement, again, for David. And a ninth character trait to be found both in David, Jonathan, and David. What character trait of a good friendship do you think we're missing? Trust, generosity, humility, loyalty, compassion, honesty, integrity, encouragement. Oh, it's not revealing. But first, let's clean up one of the missing Bible references for just David. During his exile, David had 2 opportunities to kill Saul. In 1 Samuel 24, verse 3 to 7, we read,
King Saul came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. In 1 Samuel 26, verse 7 to 11, so David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head, and let's go.
So he has 2 Bible references that demonstrate David's moral uprightness, which is in the 7th row. So the Bible references for David are 1 Samuel 24, verses 3 to 7, and 1 Samuel 26, verses 7 to 12. Ziklag. And here's a second story about David. Apart from his relationship with Jonathan, that demonstrates the character trait of encouragement.
While David and his band of mighty men were away on a mission, Amalekites attacked their home in Ziklag. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. God reassured David that he and his men could pursue and overtake the Amalekites, but 200 of his 600 men were too exhausted to go on. So David attacked with 400, fighting from dusk until the following evening. They recovered everyone and everything that had been taken, family members and livestock. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies."
Here David is not only reassuring to those of his men who were exhausted, rather than being judgmental, but is also generous to his friends. Let's get that added to our worksheets. David was reassuring to those of his men who were exhausted. So 1 Samuel 30, verse 21 to 24 counts as a reference for encouragement in row 7 for David. Yes, 1 Samuel 30, verse 21 to 24. And he was generous to his friends. So 1 Samuel 30, verse 26 is another example of his generosity. And that is up in row 2, right at the top, second row from the top. 1 Samuel 30, verse 26. The Bible doesn't tell us of any further meetings between Jonathan and David. Jonathan must have known, as did King Saul, that the ensuing battle with the Philistines would be a lost cause. Nonetheless, he and his 2 brothers followed their father into battle, and all 4 died on Mount Gilboa that day. Jonathan and his brothers had been princes in line for the throne of Israel, and Jonathan is one of the few Bible characters about whom we are told nothing bad, no glaring faults. He would have made a wonderful king, so much better than his father. But God, of course, knew in advance that Jonathan wouldn't live long enough to become king of Israel. And so David had already been anointed by Samuel the prophet years earlier.
When David heard of Saul's and Jonathan's deaths, he and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword.
David, a poet as well as a warrior, created a eulogy for Saul and Jonathan, calling it the lament of the bow. He commanded that it be taught to all of Judah, and his tribute ended with,
"I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished."
First of all, let's discuss the elephant in the room. Some would like to believe that this relationship was a homosexual one because of how David described it, more wonderful than that of women. But by this time, David already had 3 wives, 2 of whom had been in exile with him. During the following 7 years, while reigning as Judah's king, David had a son born to him by each of those 2 wives, and 4 more sons from 4 other wives or concubines. It's doubtful that he was gay. However, that's really not the point here. Hebrew has only 1 word for love, but the Greeks had 4. Love for family, like a mother's love, brotherly love for a friend, sexual love for a spouse, and unconditional love, agape. I think that David saw a pure love, God's agape, reflected in his friend Jonathan. I've heard agape love described as the orange peel that holds within it all the other fruits of the Spirit, like the sections of an orange. We have joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This type of love is more wonderful than the love shared between spouses. So we have found our final character trait. Remember when the men first met? Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So a synonym for love, devotion, a fancy one is unconditional acceptance of the person, not of all behaviors. Unconditional. And an antonym, hatred, loathing, extreme dislike. The reference for Jonathan would be 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 to 3. And the reference for David was 2 Samuel 1, verse 26. So let's review what to look for in a friend. Trust in God, generosity, humility, loyalty, compassion, honesty, integrity, encouragement, love. Those are also the values that make us a good friend to others. Jesus explained in John 15, verse 15 to 16.
I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you.
I'd like to conclude by asking for your input. Please unmute yourselves. And let's go back through those characteristics of a good friend. I'd like you to suggest times at which Jesus demonstrated each trait himself. Trusting God.
Acceptance of his role on the cross.
That's a good one. Deborah nodding your head. Generosity.
His role on the cross.
Okay, you say again, his role on the cross.
We could also say the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000.
Yes,
The fact that he took, or maybe it's not my God.
I didn't hear that. What was that?
It was me changing my mind.
Humility.
When he washed the disciples' feet.
Yeah.
That's good.
Very good one.
The Last Supper.
Loyalty. Some of us might have put down reliability or the promise keeper. Am I embroidering too much there?
I have come to do the will of my Father.
Yeah. Compassion. Melanie?
Well, that he kept healing and having compassion on the crowds that would come to him, even when he was exhausted, he would still allow them to come.
When he healed the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, because he had told her he came towards the Jews, and the woman said that even the dog ate the crumbs. So he had compassion on that Syrophoenician woman, and her daughter was healed.
Honesty.
When he told Peter to get the coin and paid taxes for both of them.
Ooh, that's good.
Integrity or moral uprightness.
His whole life was an example of moral uprightness.
When he was tempted after 40 days of fasting, and Satan said, do this, do that, and he responded with the word of God.
Okay. Encouragement.
John chapter 17. I think it actually compassed all of these together.
And love.
The Last Supper.
Dying on the cross for us.
And Jesus told his disciples,
You are my friends if you do what I command you.
so what did Jesus expect from his disciples? Trusting God, generosity, humility, loyalty, compassion, honesty, integrity, encouragement, and love. This is my command: love each other.
Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends.